This reading is from the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 6 through 22. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night, and there should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the land of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? When the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me." So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest.
So how many of us have ever been slandered? How many of you have ever been in a situation where somebody says something about you that is simply not true, something negative about you? Maybe they twist your words, something that they take those words and they take them out of context, or they just completely misrepresent them, or maybe they just completely make something up. It's something that challenges your integrity, right? Something that challenges your character. And they say this, they spread this, they slander you, and you know that it's not that maybe they misunderstood or they were misinformed, but they deliberately make something up or twist something in order to defame you or demean you in some regard. Have you ever had that? Ever been slandered? And you wonder to yourself, right, when that happens, you wonder why. Like why would they do this? What would lead them to behave this way? Maybe you haven't been slandered, but maybe you've been in a situation where you saw somebody just really blow up, really lose their temper, go into a fit of rage. So this past week, I was at church camp, and it reminded me when I went to church camp 30 years ago, I just have to say, Kyle Smith, my buddy Kyle Smith, he comes in here. Yeah, raise your hand, Kyle. Sorry, you didn't know I was going to call you out. He came here last week, right before I'm getting ready to go to church camp. And I don't know if I've seen him since church camp. I mean, it's like 30 years ago, church camp, we went to the same camp, the camp where I became a believer. His younger brother, Ari, he and I were really good friends. We actually got in trouble, me and Ari, all the time at church camp. I mean, he and I were kind of a dangerous combination. I think the counselors had to separate us because we would just cause trouble. But man, it's awesome to have you and your wife, Jerry, here with us this morning, especially as I'm talking about camp. But I remember one time I was, as I got older, I became a counselor at this camp that I had gone to for years. And I remember one time we were playing ultimate frisbee. It was middle school. By the way, I learned later on in life, I had always thought, I'd come to believe that I was this incredible ultimate frisbee player. But then it turned out the reason why is because the only time I ever played was as a counselor for middle schoolers. And so then when I actually played with people my age, I realized I wasn't that good. Anyway, so I was a counselor for this 6th grade middle school age camp, and we're playing ultimate frisbee, and my team was winning. And then all of a sudden, and this is honestly, the camp pastor who was on the other team all of a sudden just lost it. And started kind of yelling and accusing us of cheating, and just kind of this fit of rage, to the point where even the kids on his own team were like, I don't know what's going on here. You ever come across that? Ever experienced that where somebody just has this fit of rage, and you wonder, well, what is underneath this? Why are they acting this way? You ever been slandered? Ever seen somebody with a fit of rage? Maybe you've seen someone where it's not a fit of rage, but you can just see in them an anger that just sort of seethes beneath the surface, and it always comes out. They're always just a little bit cold, right? They're always giving you the cold shoulder, or maybe the silent treatment, or just little remarks here or there. And again, you wonder, like, what is going on there? What is underneath that? What's interesting is that the Bible suggests that oftentimes all of these different behaviors, whether it's fits of rage or slander or just an anger that kind of bubbles up, well, it's interesting because one of the things that it suggests is this: all kinds of unpleasant behavior can be traced back to one thing: bitterness. Bitterness is often, not always, but often the root of many of these unpleasant behaviors. You know, in the book of Galatians, Apostle Paul lists the fruit of the Spirit. He talks about what happens when the Spirit works in you, and you begin to produce these different dimensions of the fruit of the Spirit. He talks about love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness. He goes on. Many scholars agree that the order of those words is not unintentional, or at least it's important to note what the first word is. And the first dimension is love. And many think that in Paul's understanding of this, it's because love actually leads to, is the root of many of these other kind of qualities and characteristics that a person might have. So in other words, a joyful person, right? Christian joy comes from experiencing the love of God. Right? Peace, the peace and sort of tranquility also comes from the love of God in that person. And so the love is the root that enables those other, behaviors or attitudes or dispositions to manifest themselves. And I might suggest that the Bible says something similar about bitterness. That bitterness can be the root of many other things. In another letter of Paul's, in his letter to the church in Ephesus, look what he says here. He says, get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. And again, I would say I don't think it's unintentional that bitterness is first, because oftentimes bitterness is the root that leads to the rage, the anger, the brawling, the slander, so on and so forth. And what substantiates this idea even more is that in the book of Hebrews, it says this exactly. Look what it says in Hebrews. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many may be defiled. So we see this idea that bitterness is often what's beneath the surface, right? So like if you look at a tree and you see the trunk and you see the branches and you see the leaves, right? Well, what's beneath the surface, right, are the roots. They're what gives life to whatever is in that tree. And what this is suggesting is that bitterness is often what's beneath the surface. I would like to suggest also that what we find here is really the difference between, in terms of what we emphasize, the difference between a merely moralistic or merely religious culture and a truly gospel-centered culture. In a merely moralistic culture, moralistic or religious in the pejorative sense, the word religion, I think, can also be used in a positive sense, but it's often used negatively these days. And I think if we use it that way, a sort of moralistic religious culture is one that tends to focus on what's above the surface. Focuses on those external behaviors, right? And identifies those sins. And of course, some of them are more flamboyant than others. And so people who have those, well, they get kind of called out more because they're more obvious and whatnot. But the religious culture really focuses on those external sins, you might say. Whereas gospel culture realizes, wait a minute, those are just symptoms of something much deeper. We got to go beneath the surface. We've got to see what is the root of these behaviors. And what the Bible often suggests, not always, is that oftentimes the root of these unpleasant behaviors is bitterness. Now, why do I mention this? Because as we come to this passage today, what do we come across? We come across a woman who is very, very, very bitter. Today we are continuing in our series on the book of Ruth. It's a series that we began last week, and we're just going to be moving through the book of Ruth over the next several months, just reading through this story. The book of Ruth tells an amazing story, and so we're just sort of working our way through it. Last week, in the beginning of the story, it sort of set the stage for the rest of the story, and in the beginning, we discover that Naomi is experiencing life as bad as it gets. Now, those first 5 verses of the book just describe life as bad as it gets. I mentioned this takes place during the period of the Judges, which also corresponds with what's sometimes known as the late Bronze Age collapse, which was a time in ancient history that was very difficult for many people throughout the ancient world, the ancient Mediterranean world, the ancient Near East. It was a season where for several hundred years there was climate change, there was severe drought, and this actually led to migration patterns. People had to leave where they were living to go find greener pastures, try to find somewhere else to live. And of course, we find this is precisely the case here with Naomi and her family. They have to leave their home of Bethlehem. We saw that Bethlehem was probably their sort of ancestral home. Life there going back for generations with their family, and they're sort of forced to leave it, and they're forced to go to Moab, which to the Israelites in this time was not where you wanted to go. We find in the book of Judges that Moab was often an enemy of the Israelites. In fact, a number of scholars suggest that the Moabite identity was actually formed in opposition to the rise of Israel. That the Moabites, that they were, before Israel came in to the land, they were more sort of scattered tribes and whatnot. But then when Israel came in and there was opposition, then they had to band together, and so their Moabite identity became stronger, and their Moabite identity was forged against the opposition that was coming from Israel, right? So that became a part of their identity. And so here's poor Naomi and her family having to go to Moab, go to the very place where they have been, that is where these enemies of them have been living, right? That just shows sort of how desperate their situation probably was. And then, of course, what do we see? Her husband dies and her children die. Her 2 boys die. And they before they die, they marry these 2 Moabite women, which, you know, for an Israelite, wasn't exactly the sort of the dream for your a parent's dream would not have been for their children to marry these Moabite women. And then what happens? The sons die before they even have any children. And so now Naomi is left without her husband, without her children, without any grandchildren in a foreign land, right? It was life as bad as it gets. And so, of course, how does she respond to this? Well, she responds with bitterness. And it's not just like, we don't just conjecture, well, it seems like maybe, I don't know, what do you think? You think she's bitter? It seems like maybe she's bitter. No, she says that she is bitter. Look at this here in verse 20. She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." There it is. Bitterness. And then the name. She says, don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara. This is sort of missed in the English translation, but the Hebrew word for bitterness is marar. And so she picks a name, so basically just call me bitter. Because that's what I am. I'm just bitter, so just call me bitter. And so then when we see that she's this bitter woman, then as we read the text, you can kind of see the bitterness throughout just about everything that she says. Verse 8, but Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, right, she's getting ready to go back to Bethlehem, and Ruth especially wants to go with her. But she says to them, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." Now, I think you've got to see sarcasm. This is just dripping with sarcasm. And, oftentimes I think bitter people, sarcasm is sort of one of their weapons. Isn't that true? I mean, when you're bitter, you just kind of, you say things where there's subtext. There's what you say, and then there's what you mean, right? So my suggestion is in this verse, may the Lord deal kindly with you. Not like me. He didn't deal kindly with me, but maybe he will deal kindly with you. Then verse 9, the Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Not like me. No, he didn't grant for me to find rest in the house of my husband, but maybe he will for you. You can just kind of see it's dripping with sarcasm. Then it goes on, verses 11 through 13. But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my wombs that you may become your husbands?" Right? This is just kind of joking, that kind of joking, bitter sarcasm. "Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night, and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Right? What do we see here? We see a picture of a bitter, bitter woman. My question for you is have you ever met anybody like that? You ever met anybody who has become bitter? Maybe they didn't used to be bitter. In fact, maybe they used to be a very pleasant and delightful person. But now they've sort of turned into a person of bitterness. Right? They used to be pleasant and delightful, which, by the way, is what the word Naomi means. Her name means pleasant and delightful. No wonder she changed her name. She's like, that's not me anymore. How many of us have maybe known a Naomi, but seen that Naomi turn into a Mara? Go from joyful, delightful, but then they turn into a person of bitterness. How many of us honestly see some of that in ourselves? How many of us, if we're honest, acknowledge that we harbor some bitterness? We harbor bitterness as a result of the way life has gone. Maybe you're bitter because your career has not gone the way you thought that it would go. Maybe you're bitter because a relationship didn't go the way you thought it would go. And here you are at a point in your life you never thought you would be in. And you're bitter. How many of us know a bitter person? How many of us have seen this bitterness in our own lives to the point where, we kind of begin to just see the world through bitter colored glasses? Become very suspicious of everything. We see the darkness in things. We see the bad in things. Right? For us, the glass is definitely half empty. So the question for us this morning is this: how do I overcome bitterness? How do I deal with this? How do I get rid of this bitterness? And I would suggest, and I'm just going to lay it out for you very straightforwardly, very simply, right? It's a very straightforward concept, right? Working it out in your life is more complicated, but we got to start with just the simple truth of how we overcome bitterness and say this. This is what emerges from this text and from Scripture in general. Here it is. To overcome bitterness, you must come to a greater confidence in the love and kindness of God. You see, what I want to show us here is that Naomi here, her theology is off. She's got a little bit of a theology problem. And so I kind of want to talk about theology. Can we do a little theology class here for a moment? Okay, can we put on a little theology hats? Okay, we're going to talk about theology here for a moment. Now, this word theology, it can be a word that is used to refer to the study of really anything from a theistic perspective, right? Seeing things through the lens of one who believes in God. So for example, you could have anthropology. Christian anthropology is the study of the human person, but Christian anthropology is the study of the human person through the lens of one who believes in God, right? Or cosmology would be another theological category where you try to understand the universe, the nature of the universe and the world and whatnot through a theistic lens, understanding it through the lens of one who believes in God. Okay, so theology can be used to describe virtually the study of anything from a theistic perspective. But we can also use that word to talk more narrowly just about God himself. Like what do we believe about God himself? And that's what I want to do. I want to give you a quick crash course in the doctrine of God. And really what I want to do is I want to set up two pillars. I would say that when it comes to our understanding of God, there's really two main dimensions of this, and virtually every other aspect of the doctrine of God flows out of these. Okay, so two pillars in terms of our understanding of God. The first one is this: God is sovereign. God is sovereign. He is providential, right? He is working and orchestrating all things. He has sovereignty over everything. And in its ancient context, right, this theme would have been pitted against what was believed in the ancient world by most people, and that was that there were lots of little gods who had kind of their own jurisdiction, right? So like Ashur is a god of the Assyrians, and so like, if you're passing through the land of Assyria, well, maybe you should offer a sacrifice to Ashur because that's his region, right? That's his area. And so you'd have different gods that were kind of had local control. This is how it was believed, that had sort of local control over certain regions. Or you'd have gods that had control over certain sort of dimensions of nature and life, right? So you'd have Baal, who for the Canaanites was seen as the god of storms and god of fertility, because he would provide water for the crops and make them fertile, right? So he'd have a certain Aphrodite. Getting into the Greeks, Aphrodite was a goddess who oversaw love and romance and that sort of thing, right? So you'd have different gods that sort of had jurisdiction over different things, and so then over and over again against this backdrop, the Bible is always saying, no, there is one God who is in control of everything, sovereign over all things. And in fact, we find that this emerges right in the beginning of the Bible. The first several chapters of Genesis, when it talks about creation, Right? And when we look at the story of creation, we often bring our own modern questions to that text. And often we do so, and in doing so, we kind of distort what the text is really all about. I mean, just to put it rather bluntly, when it describes creation and talks about the 6 days of creation, we can debate until we're blue in the face whether those are 6 literal days or they're not meant to be taken literally. And different Christians have different views on that, right? So some like to highlight, they'll say, well, the sun was created on the 4th day. So if the sun's created on the 4th day, well, then how do you know how long the first several days were? If the sun wasn't even around to create day, how can you say that those days were so long? And like, okay, that's a fun argument, but that whole conversation is just completely missing the point. That's not what, in its ancient context, people were interested in. What was going on there is what was being painted in this beautiful poetic way was basically saying God is sovereign over all things. And so, for example, the creation of the sun on the 4th day, well, guess what? The sun was one of the primary gods of the Egyptians. And they had just, if we trace these stories back to Moses, right, they had just come out of Egypt. And so the Egyptians worshiped the sun god. And so by saying that the sun was created on the 4th day, regardless of what we think about those days, the primary point is that it was created by God. And it wasn't even the first thing. It's just, it's the 4th day I'll create the sun. So it was a way of saying our God is the one who is sovereign over all things, right? Those early chapters of Genesis are not designed to address the question of how things were created, but rather they're designed to answer the question of who created them. And the answer is God, because the one God, Yahweh, is sovereign over all things. So we could go on and on throughout the Bible where it talks about the sovereignty of God. I'll highlight just one passage in the book of Colossians. Here it's actually talking about Jesus and his divinity and his sovereignty over all things. It says, "For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Everything is being held together by the power of God. That's how sovereign he is over everything in this world. So God is a sovereign God. He orchestrates all things. He is providential over all things. Right? That's one of the major pillars. The first pillar of Christian theology. Actually, I'd say it's second in priority. We'll come to the one that is actually first, but I'm using that first for another reason. Okay, so that's the first pillar. The second pillar, God is sovereign. The second major pillar is this: God is a loving and kind God. And for reasons I won't get into now, I'd actually say that's first. But these are the two pillars. God is sovereign and God is loving. God is kind. And again, we could spend all day looking at passages that unpack God's love and his kindness. I'll just look at one. This is Psalm 136, which just celebrates the love of God. "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his steadfast love endures forever." And then the psalm goes on and on and on, and it talks about creation and says that creation is really an act of God's love. And then it goes on and talks about when they were enslaved in Egypt and God delivered them, gave them salvation, and that is an example of the love of God, and it endures forever. And after every phrase, it says his love endures forever. And so we see this theme, that God is sovereign, and God is loving and kind. And you know what? When you come to Easter weekend, what we celebrate, you find both of these coming together. In the death of Jesus, you see the ultimate expression of God's love. And in the resurrection, you see the ultimate expression of his providence and his sovereignty. Everything in the Old Testament is building towards those two things. Right? So pretty much everything else in Christian theology flows out of that. God is sovereign and God is loving and kind, right? These are two pillars of Christian theology. Okay, so now let's go back to Naomi. And Naomi's little theology quiz. How's she do for her theology? Well, okay, here's the thing. The first pillar is that God is sovereign. She gets that. Right? That comes through. She understands God's providence over all things. Notice this here, chapter 1, verse 13b. Would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. And then in verse 21, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? See this? She sees the sovereignty of God. Now, she sees it simply as he's the one that brought all of this calamity upon me. He's the one that caused this. He caused the famine. He caused my kids to not be able to have children. He caused my sons to die. Right? He's sovereign over all things. Now, this, of course, raises questions for many people here, I'm sure. Is it really that simple? God causes everything? God causes all calamity? I would say there are two answers to that. The first one is yes, and the second one is no. Right? There is a tension that emerges in Scripture, a tension that used to drive me nuts. Now I actually find it to be quite beautiful and to make the most sense. But there's this tension where on one hand, yes, God is the one that sends calamity. God is the one that sends tragedy. But on the other hand, no, he doesn't. And we find all kinds of examples of calamity and things that happen where it's not attributed to God. I'll just give one kind of example. When David has Uriah the Hittite killed. And he kills him so that he can take his wife Bathsheba as his own wife, right? It's very clear that David is the one who is responsible for this. It's not God. I don't say God killed Uriah. Right? It's no, David was the one, and he is responsible for that. He sinned in having Uriah killed. It's not God. Now, of course, God in his providence uses that, uses Bathsheba, uses that to continue on his story. So God uses it, but you wouldn't just say that he caused it. So there's a tension here. And this is one that'll just drive you crazy if you don't already know this one. So in the Old Testament, it basically tells the history of the people of Israel. But believe it or not, there's actually two different accounts, kind of like you have two different volumes that tell you American history, right? And they're very different. So you have the Samuel King's narrative, that's one account of the history of Israel. And then you have the account in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And they cover much the same material. But sometimes they say things that are very different. So one kind of classic example is in the Samuel King's narrative. It talks about when David takes a census, meaning he counts how many people, how many men he has in his army. He's trying to figure out how big his army he has. And so he counts his men. And for reasons I won't get into, he's not supposed to do that. He shouldn't have done that. God didn't want him to do that, okay? Okay, but here's where it gets crazy. Ready for this? In the Samuel King's narrative, it says that God incited him to count the census. In the First Chronicles and 2nd Chronicles narrative, you know what it says there? It says that Satan incited him to do the census. And what I love is that the scribes didn't try to fix that. They just leave it there. They just leave it there with this tension, which I think is beautiful, actually. But what it highlights is that, yes, God is providential, but it's not quite that simple, that we are not just puppets, right? There are other forces also that are at work, okay? But in the end, yes, we would say God is providential, right? There's a whole lot more we could say, but that's not really even my point. We just got to get back to the main point here. Ruth here understands that God is sovereign over all things. But what has she lost sight of? She's lost sight of the kindness of God. She no longer has confidence that God is really a loving God. And we see this, there's sort of a bitter irony in one of her comments. She says this in verse 8, "May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me, right? Not like God's dealt with me, but the way you've dealt with me. God hasn't been kind to me. You have been, but God hasn't been. And what's interesting is that the word that is used there for kindness is the Hebrew word hesed, which is one of the primary words that is used to express God's covenantal relationship with his people. God is in covenant with us. God loves us with this hesed, this loving kindness. And Naomi is like attacking that very concept, saying, well, no, God, I don't see the covenantal love of God. I don't see it from him. I see it from you guys, but I don't see it from God. So Naomi, she gets the sovereignty of God, but she has lost faith in the kindness of God. And so she's bitter. Because the way you overcome bitterness is by coming to a greater confidence in the love and the kindness of God. And of course, at this point, some of us are saying, well, it seems like she's got good reason, right? I mean, I can understand why she's questioning the love and the kindness of God when you look at all that has happened to her. Why would she not think this way? And here's what I would suggest is the answer to this conundrum. I'm just going to put it this way. Here's Naomi's issue. Naomi is not thinking eschatologically. Has anyone ever said that to you? Anyone ever said, you know what your problem is? You're just not thinking eschatologically. Anyone ever said that to you? I mentioned the movie Back to the Future last week, one of my favorite movies of all time. Because it's about time travel, I've discovered a movie doesn't have to be good for me to like it if it's about time travel. It can get like 5% on Rotten Tomatoes. If it has time travel, I'll love it, no matter how bad it is. Anyway, Back to the Future is a good one, though. But there's this scene where Doc Brown, the scientist, is explaining to Marty his time machine, and he's explaining what is entailed with time travel. Time travel is not simple. You know that, right? It's kind of complicated. And so he's explaining to Marty what happens when you go back in time and forward in time, and Marty's just not getting it. And so Doc Brown looks at Marty and says, you know what, Marty, here's the problem. You're just not thinking fourth dimensionally. And Marty's like, yeah, I have that problem all the time. I just don't, right? Well, similarly, if Doc Brown were here and he were preaching this message, he would say, you know what the problem is with Naomi? She's just not thinking eschatologically. And here's what I mean by this. To think eschatologically is to think beyond the present. You see, what's being addressed here in classical terms is what's known as the question of theodicy. And theodicy is a question that really emerges, especially in Christian theology, precisely because Christians believe that God is sovereign and loving, fully sovereign and fully loving. And so the question that emerges is, well, if God is really sovereign and God is really loving, then why is there so much hardship? Why is there suffering in this world? Like, how do you reconcile those? Right? I mean, if God wasn't loving, like Naomi seems to be suggesting, well, then it makes sense. Or maybe God is loving, but he's not sovereign. There's nothing he can do about it. Well, then that would kind of explain the hardship and the suffering that we experience. But if we're going to hold to this idea that God is loving and he is sovereign, well, then why is there suffering in this world? And the issue here is that when you ask that question, you're thinking philosophically, when you need to be thinking eschatologically. The answer to this question is found in realizing that you have to be able to see beyond the present. That the Bible, believe this, the Bible is not a book of philosophy. The Bible is a story. You see, as Christians, we need to be able to think, not just in terms of the way things are. We need to learn how to think in terms of the way things were, are, and will be. That's what it means to think eschatologically, to think beyond the present. And what you discover is when you read the prophetic literature, which takes up a vast amount of what we find in the Old Testament, this is one of the main things that the prophets are trying to do, is they're trying to get their people to think eschatologically. They're trying to get them to think beyond the present. Sometimes they'll be like, look, you guys are living in the lap of luxury. You're just living in the present. You're not looking out for anybody but yourself. You need to think about the future because God is not okay with that, and he's going to do something about that. He's going to bring judgment on the fact that you've just been living for yourself. Stop living right now in the moment and think about what is coming down the pipe. But then other times the prophets will say, especially to those who are hurting and suffering, so you also need to think about the future because guess what? God is coming for you. God sees your hurt. He sees your pain. And he's going to bring redemption. And that's what this story points to, right? You see, Naomi, as well as us, we cannot base our understanding of God on our present experience alone. If you base your understanding of God on your present experience alone, it'll be up and down. You're like, I love God, he's so wonderful. Where is God? I don't know where God is. It's just up and down and up and down. If you base your understanding of God on your present experience, it will be a roller coaster your whole life. And so what this book teaches us, what the prophets are always exhorting us to do, is to think beyond the present and to see that things may be hard now, but guess what? God is going to come. And of course, this is what we will discover as we move through the book of Ruth. We're going to see, as I mentioned last week, this is not ultimately a story of hardship. It's a story of redemption. So, for many people, the months of January and February are like the worst months of the year. Am I right? Just because it's freezing and it's cold and it's dark and you hate it, right? I'm a little bit different, actually. I can't stand the summer. I like to go running and I like to ski. And both of those are much better in the winter. It's just way too hot. So like when I'm out there running in the heat, I'm just like, sun, would you please just go away? I'm like looking at the leaves on the trees and I'm like, will you die already? Anyway, that's me. But for most people, right, it's January and February you can't stand. Can't stand the cold. Can't stand how dark it is. But here's the thing. You know what's coming in the future. You know that spring is coming. You know that summer is coming. And in many ways, that's what gets you through. And actually, when you know that, guess what happens? Because you know that, you start to see signs of its emergence early on. Because you know it's coming, you start to see signs. You start to see the buds on the trees before they bloom. And you know that that's pointing to something ahead. Right? There's all kinds of signs that spring and summer is coming. One of my favorite signs is March Madness, right? When March Madness comes, you know the winter's over, spring's coming. Right? There are these different signs that we see because we know what is coming. But see, if you don't know what's coming, you're not looking for the signs, and then you miss them. And the same thing is true in our own lives. God's ultimate plan is to bring healing and renewal and redemption in our lives. And when we know that, guess what? If you look carefully, I bet you will see signs of that redemption already at work. And this is what Naomi misses. You see, it's Naomi misses the signs of redemption that are right there in front of her. Look at this, verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. Already a sign of redemption. Already a sign that God has come, that he's allowing her to go back to her homeland where now there is food available. But she doesn't see that. She doesn't see the sign of redemption. Here's I'd say the biggest one. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Ruth is this neon sign blinking in the darkness saying, God has not forgotten you. God places Ruth in Naomi's life as a sign of redemption to point ahead to what he is going to do. Friends, how do we overcome bitterness? We begin to think beyond the present. We begin to think eschatologically. We remember that God is a God who's going to bring redemption. And when we do so, we will start to see signs. I would encourage you right now, if you find yourself in a place of bitterness, look for those signs of redemption. Look for those little signs of God's loving kindness breaking through in the darkness as a message to you saying, I have not forgotten you. I love you, and I'm going to redeem you. How do we overcome bitterness in our lives? Look for signs of God's redeeming love. That's how we overcome bitterness in our own lives. But you know what? You can go beyond that. You can not only receive the signs of God's redeeming love, you can be a sign of redeeming love, right? Be a sign of God's redeeming love. This is what Ruth is. Right, so now we can shift. Say, what does Ruth point to? Ruth is a sign of God's redeeming love. You realize that you have the opportunity. When you see somebody who is going through hard times, you see somebody who is asking these questions, where is God in the midst of this? Well, guess what? You have the opportunity to be that sign of redemption, to be a person who embodies loving kindness in their lives. See, this is how we overcome bitterness in our own lives, and this is how we can help others overcome bitterness as well. We now come to our time of communion. What is communion all about? Well, communion, in many respects, is one of the biggest signs. It's a sign that points to God's redemption. The bread and the cup represent the body and the blood of Christ. They point to the death of Jesus, reminding us of the incredible love for us. And they point to his resurrection, which is the ultimate sign, the first fruits, as the Apostle Paul says, of what is to come, reminding us that God has not forgotten us in our darkness. God loves us, and God will bring redemption. And may that clear away the bitterness that we so often carry.